For today's presentation, we'll be doing our preview of our final section of the class, the institutional foundations of gender. So before we turn our attention to how institutions relate to gender, just a brief reminder of what we've done so far. So far we've looked at our sociological framework to explain gender and gender inequality by looking at culture and social psychology. Culture provides us the directions, the meanings we attach to the sexes, and these directions inform how we try to achieve maleness, how we try to achieve femaleness, how we interact with other people, and how we interact with ourselves. The social psychology dimension highlights how we internalize this gendered culture and we transform that collective culture into personal identities and personal beliefs. And so ultimately, together, this internalization of the external gender culture, making gendered culture a true social force through gendered identities, through our gender beliefs. So again, if the culture is only outside of us, then it's not going to influence how we see ourselves, how we see other people based upon ideas of masculinity and femininity. But once we do learn that culture and make it part of how we see ourselves, how we see other people, then gender becomes a true social force. Now we can turn our attention to our course framework. So far, again, we've concentrated on the two dimensions, the cultural and social psychological dimensions, but now we can turn a focus to the institutional dimension. And it's been there along the way, but we haven't really talked about it directly. So that's what we'll be doing in this last part of the class. And when looking at institutions, we'll be looking at them individually, but also by looking at institutions, we can start to say we understand the connection of all three, the interplay of institutions, culture, and social psychology when it comes to creating gender and gender inequality. So in doing so, one question we can look at is how is gendered culture produced? We say gendered culture, like any other form of culture, does not appear out of thin air. It is not coming out of the blue. So how does it produced? Where does it come from? And then another question we can look at is where do people internalize gender culture? So where do we make those ideas of masculinity and femininity part of our social psychology? So those are two questions we can focus on to recognize the significance of institutions when it comes to culture and when it comes to gendered culture, when it comes to social psychology, when it comes to gendered social psychology. Before we start to connect the dots between an institution and gender, let's take a minute to conceptualize what we mean when we say an institution. So an institution is a sphere of social life that's organized to meet certain human needs. So a sphere of social life, an institution, could be a family, it could be religion, media, the economy, government, education, sport, so on and so on. So an institution not only is a sphere of social life, but it also is organized to meet certain human needs. And so the organization part of an institution often is in the division of labor. And so who is doing what? So for an example, you see parents taking care of children in the family rather than the children taking care of the parents. And you see people in the media, writers, producers, all doing their roles and responsibility. So based upon the organization, of an institution. It can be functional. And regarding the function of an institution, each one has a different function. Each one is there to meet a different human need. So a family is there to provide care and nourishment for people. Religion provides us an understanding of the unknown, so what we can't really conclude from science or any type of empirical research, kind of the mystery of life. The media provides us information and entertainment. The economy is responsible for the production and consumption of goods. Then we can look at government as providing law and order. So again, an institution is a sphere of social life that's organized, and through its organization, it can help us meet certain human needs. We can look further into institutions by saying that institutions provide us a social space in which we encounter and we learn a specific culture. So when you go to a religious space, in that space you encounter and learn religious culture. At home, perhaps in the living room or in the dining room, you're being exposed to culture, kind of a little bit different than religious culture, but nevertheless a form of culture being provided to people by siblings, by parents. So it's within these spaces that the institution provides us, the religious space, the family room space, that we call institutional agents, people representing the institutions. So a parent representing the family, a priest representing a religion, teachers representing education, writers representing media, politicians representing government. So these institutional agents are producing culture. And it can be other people in those same spaces. Like I mentioned before, it could be siblings, it could be your peers at school. So we look at how institutional agents and others within the institutional space produce culture. And the production of culture is taught to us both formally and informally. So directly and indirectly, we learn culture. And then also these institutions are responsible for organizing relationships around social factors. So we organize people around factors such as their sex, being a male or female, their class background. So for example, the government organizes how much you pay in taxes based upon your class position, your race. And so education, you can look at how universities may provide certain financial assistance, certain scholarships to certain races and not others. And age is a big factor of how the government, how our schools organize us based upon our age. We can bring together institutional work to gender by recognizing the role of institutions when it comes to producing a gender culture and providing spaces in which we learn and we internalize gender culture. So specifically looking at how ideas of masculinity and femininity are produced. They're produced by our social institutions. So our family, produces these ideas for us. They tell us about what it's supposed to be a boy or a girl. We learn this culture in our schools. We learn it by interacting with the media. So the institutions of a society produce gendered culture. So here we can see the link between institutions and culture. And then also we can link institutions to social psychology by recognizing institutions provide us the spaces in which we learn this gender culture. We make it part of our social psychology. So the classroom, again, the dining room or the family room, the field, the locker room, all these are spaces in which we're learning gender culture making it part of our social psychology. So again, here we see all three dimensions of our course framework coming together. Institutions produce culture. Institutions provide us the spaces in which we learn culture. So we see the interplay of how institutions, culture, and social psychology all come together to produce gender and contribute to gender inequalities. And lastly, we can look at how institutions organize the sexes into different spaces. So whether it be a women's bathroom and a men's bathroom, whether it be one locker room or another, whether it be taking certain type of classes or other types of classes, it's much easier to gender people, to socialize people in gendered ways when the sexes are separated from one another. So in other words, you can't teach a bunch of kids, how to be men if those kids are both women and men in the same space. So, okay, for the boys here, you're supposed to do this, but for the girls here, you're supposed to do something else. So that gender socialization sometimes is problematic when you have the sexes in the same spaces. But when you separate the sexes into, different teams, into different sports, into any type of different space, it's much easier to try to gender boys into masculinity. It's much easier to gender girls into femininity. So that's our preview of our final part of the class, looking at the role of institutions when it comes to gender inequality, but also recognizing the interplay of all three parts of our course framework when it comes to gender and gender inequality. So we'll leave that there for today, and I'll be back soon as I can with another presentation.